Welcome back, my friends, to the retro gaming show that never ends. And we have a very spooky Halloween episode for you today. And man, it's been a long time, as I discussed in my last video, but here we all are, December 1989, Part 2. The last all 1989 episode, since next time we'll actually start in on 1990. And you know what 1990 is, the year the Super Famicom debuted, the last year that the plain old Famicom had the field all to itself. And don't get me wrong, the Famicom remained in a very strong position for a couple years. We won't even see a huge number of Super Famicom games being released until December 1991. But 1990 marks the beginning of the end for the plucky little guy. And we'll be seeing a number of big names soon, making their final 8-bit appearances. In fact, we have one today, one of everyone's favorite NES games. So let's get started in the traditional Chrontendo fashion with some absolutely terrible garbage games. Let's start off today with some US-only games from December. We don't know exactly when these were released, since video games in the US didn't really have official street dates like they do now, but according to Nintendo, December is the official month these things came out. First up, of course, is Ironsword, Wizards and Warriors 2, which, just like the first game, does not have any wizards nor any Conan-style warriors, just a dude dressed up like one of the Knights of the Round Table. At least there is some magic in this game, however. Acclaim is the publisher, and Rare's name appears all over it, but it seems to have been primarily developed by Zippo Games, which was a company Rare used to make games when Rare themselves couldn't be bothered to. Coincidentally, Zippo was also founded by two brothers, and just like Rare, they started out making computer games in England before switching over to the NES. Now, if Ironsword is remembered today, it's mostly for the game's box art, since the model for the cover painting is none other than Fabio Lazzoni. Fabio was a small-time actor and frequent model for romance novels. He wasn't really well known when Ironsword first came out, but in the early 90s people started noticing that the same guy was on all these romance novel covers, and he became something like a prototypical meme. In 1993, he attempted to transition into a full-blown celebrity, with guest appearances on TV shows, releasing romance novels written under his own name, putting out an album, appearing in commercials for I Can't Believe It's Not Butter, though the public got tired of him relatively quickly, and in 1999, when he made the news by getting hit in the face by a bird while on a roller coaster, that was pretty much the last time anyone ever heard of him. Though he does still turn up from time to time in campy, "Hey, do you remember this guy?" kind of roles. So what about the game itself? Well, just like the first Wizards and Warriors, it's pretty bad. On the surface, this might appear to be an action-adventure game, something like the Castlevania series. It's not quite like that, though. It's almost entirely about jumping, and the game's levels are very vertically orientated. It's like Zippo made a platform game and decided it should be exclusively dedicated to jumping from one platform to the other. That's what you do in this game, jump from platform to platform. Lots of games will use like one part of a level that looks like this, like maybe you're on a mountain and you have to do some ledge jumping, or you're in a jungle and you have to jump from branch to branch in the trees, but here that's almost all you do throughout the entire game. There are 6 levels, a mountain, a sky level, a forest level, an underwater level, and a volcano level, and then a cave level, as well as a very short final level on a second mountain. And there's very little variation within each level. Now luckily you can't fall to your death here, but you can very easily miss a platform and plummet back down to the bottom of the level, requiring you to jump all the way back up again. And these levels are designed to make this very, very easy to do. Missing a platform often results in you landing on like a curved surface or a slide-like surface that drops you down from one slide to the other until you hit the ground, just like you were playing Chutes and Ladders or something. Other things I hate about Ironsword, the enemies. The approach is the exact opposite of how a game like Ninja Gaiden or Castlevania works. Enemies in those are always fair. You can avoid them or kill them if you're quick enough and time your jumps and attacks correctly. Sometimes that can be very difficult, but they never overwhelm you with cheap hits. Ironsword takes the opposite approach. It bombards you non-stop with enemies which seemingly appear randomly from all directions, including from above. And the thing is that you actually can't attack enemies above you. Your character has no way to attack something above his head. And on top of all this, off-screen enemies can shoot you with projectiles, and they do this constantly, including when you're actually jumping from platform to platform in mid-jump. At least this happens in the first level. The game actually mellows out a bit as you make some progress. In the forest level, there are way fewer surprise attacks, and just way fewer enemies in general. And this level has so many health refills. The drop in difficulty and frustration from the first 2 levels to level 3 is just bizarre. So basically how each level works is you're supposed to explore all the nooks and crannies until you find some special item which you can then use to exit the level. For example, in the forest level, this dude wants a bug. The bug can only be reached by finding the water spout spell. This spell can be found inside this chest, and I have no idea whether this is a programming glitch or done deliberately, but once you are holding the spell, you will then lose it. It'll actually disappear from your inventory if you enter any doors or touch any health refills. It'll literally just vanish with no warning whatsoever. Neither the manual nor the game itself mentions that this is going to happen, so I suspect that this was not deliberate and was a programming error. Another thing the manual fails to mention is that while chickens refill your health, there are slightly larger chickens that make you lose health. No idea why. And there are some other elements here. You eventually get the ability to use magic, find better armor. You need to collect keys to open chests, but this doesn't really dispel the total monotony of this game. Everything is so ugly and dull looking. Even the final bosses are just like round blobs that fly around you in a circle and shoot at you. All this stuff doesn't really fly in a game from like late 1989. We expect more by this point. Now, as it turns out, Ironsword is not the only awful game from Acclaim this time. Nope, let's move on to the next one. Oh man, oh man, oh man. Let's move on to another Acclaim game, Cybernoid, the fighting machine. This is not a cyborg-themed fighting game, but rather a horizontal shoot-'em-up, sort of. And of course there's no music during the title screen, which is always a good sign. Now, there might have been a bit of communication problem when making this game, since this screen says you are out to kill all the Bakor pirates, and the manual says you're going after Zogian pirates. Generally speaking, science fiction shoot-'em-ups have you defending your home planet against an alien invasion force or something, but here it appears the bad guys merely stole some jewels that were hidden in a remote asteroid, so essentially you're on a mission of bloody vengeance based purely on some property theft. Okay, so here's how the game begins. Lovely color scheme, many game design elements here are pretty weird, starting with that volcano straight out of Gradius, except this volcano and all the other volcanoes that appear in the game are purely decorational. They serve no function at all, and they actually can't hurt you. Like those boulders flying out there will actually pass harmlessly through your ship, so I don't know why these volcanoes even exist. Another unusual element here is that gravity pulls your ship downward, so if you stop moving, your ship will begin to fall towards the bottom of the screen. It's a bit hard to explain Cybernoid. It appears to be a very basic shoot-'em-up, and considered as such, it fails miserably. There are very limited types of enemies, no bosses, no scrolling. The entire game is just a series of one-screen rooms. There's absolutely nothing here to amaze you or dazzle you. There's really nothing at all of visual interest compared to last episode's Abadox, for example. This is a spectacularly dull shooter. And when you factor in what might be perceived as the game's excessive difficulty and unfairness, It's tempting to call this the worst shoot-'em-up on the Famicom, and it feels like an example of Kosogi from late 1985 from Toachiki or something, rather than a game that would be released at the end of 1989. However, the game makes a bit more sense once you realize this is a port of a ZX Spectrum game published by Hewson in 1987. The original was created by one Raphael Checo. The Spectrum was not really the best platform for exciting or graphically demanding action games, which is why Cybernoid is divided up into a series of separate rooms rather than long scrolling levels. And Cybernoid was, of course, ecstatically reviewed by UK game publications. Who needs 16-bit graphics when ZX Spectrum games look this good, according to Crash Magazine? And Your Sinclair rated it as the 36th greatest game of all time. Now, this NES port was done by Gremlin Graphics, a British developer from Sheffield who released tons of computer games and became successful enough to purchase DMA Designs, who of course later got purchased by Take-Two and became Rockstar North, going on to make the Grand Theft Auto games. As for Gremlin themselves, they eventually got bought out by Infogrames and was shuttered in the early 2000s. So the upshot of all this is you can't really treat Cybernoid as a normal shoot-'em-up like you would play in an arcade game or on the NES. In fact, it might be better thought of as a shooter-puzzle hybrid. Every time you enter a new room, you need to sort of figure out how to get to the other side of the room without dying. Your default weapon is an extremely ineffective pea shooter, but you have bombs, an extremely useful, though very limited shield, a bouncer that bounces off destructive bouncing balls in several directions, as well as a weapon that simply kills all on-screen enemies, which the developers unfortunately named Genocide. Yeah, they actually called it Genocide. Also very useful is this sort of Gradius-like option thing that orbits around your ship. So basically, whenever you enter a room, you need to decide how to get across and if you'll need to use any special weapons to do so. There's only 3 levels in total, 2 short ones and then 1 longer one. And then there are hidden items as well, most notably at the end of the first 2 levels, where if you shoot the switch, a power-up will be released that turns your ship into like this mech-looking thing. And more importantly, this mech ship has much more special weapons usages. For example, you can use the shield 5 times rather than the normal 2. And weirdest of all is that normally your shield only lasts a few seconds, so it's very useful, but it disappears very quickly. But when you're powered up in mech form, you can use the shield in the first room of the new level, and the shield will somehow last for the entire first 6 rooms of levels 2 and 3. And there's really no reason why it seems to do this. I mean, if you use it again afterwards, it'll only last like 5 seconds, but you can actually use the shield to just blow through the first 6 rooms of levels 2 and 3. And this accounts for something like a third of level 2 and a nice chunk of level 3. And the weird thing is, none of this is actually documented anywhere in the manual other than a reference to hidden items. So in some sense, Cybernoid is pretty short. A speed run beat it in less than 6 minutes, with no shortcuts, just buzzing through the rooms as efficiently as possible, and a good normal player who knows about the special mech suit could get through this in, I'm sure, less than 10 minutes. There are, however, a lot of unpleasant or unfair things that will frustrate the novice Cybernoid player. So for example here, getting past these things is a major pain since, at least on the NES port, gravity pulls your ship down slightly faster than those blocks move. So when you're passing through the downward moving blocks, you need to move up ever so slightly for just a split second to avoid actually falling into the bottom block. And I'm sure a lot of kids could not get through the first screen that uses these, which happens at the very beginning of the game. Now you might think it's weird to throw in such a tough challenge, like 3 screens into the game, but unlike, titles like Super Mario Bros. Or Castlevania, Cybernoid doesn't really start off simply and increase the difficulty as it progresses. It starts off hard and then adds kind of like a few additional moving parts as it goes along, but there's not really that much difference between the first few rooms of the game and the last few rooms. And there's definitely a lot of unfair stuff in Cybernoid. Enemy ships tend to move very fast and come at you in large numbers. Your laser is a bit slow and not very effective at taking enemies out, but that wouldn't be such a huge problem if the enemies flew in patterns. However, on many of these screens where you have like a horde of enemies just sort of flying right towards you, their positions are actually randomized, which means that if you reach the far side of the screen, it is quite possible for a ship to enter right in front of you and hit you with no warning. And these unavoidable deaths are of course completely unfair, but that's just the way the game rolls. So is Cybernoid the worst shoot 'em up on the NES? Well, maybe. I mean, it's one of the ugliest, the most oddly designed, and the least enjoyable shooters on the NES. Once you figure out how to play it, it's not as bad as it appears at first glance, but this is certainly not a game I would recommend to anyone, except out of morbid curiosity. So here we have one of the most infamous US NES games, one that disappointed countless kids on Christmas Day 1989, I'm sure. In the 80s, the X-Men were a hot property for Marvel, at least in terms of comic sales, if not name recognition by the general public. X-Men were not originally A-list characters, but during the late 70s to early 80s, the creative team of Chris Claremont and John Byrne turned it into one of Marvel's most popular titles. Over the course of the decade, Claremont gradually lost his mind, and the comic took a rather unpleasant sadistic turn to it, but still remained immensely popular. Near the end of 1989, there was a standalone animated special called Pride of the X-Men that aired during Marvel Action Universe, which was Marvel's rather bizarre Saturday morning cartoon show, which combined old episodes of Spider-Man and Fantastic Four with newer cartoons such as Dino Riders and RoboCop. And of course, a couple years later, the X-Men would get their own weekly cartoon. There's not really much to say about X-Men as a game. You choose to play one of 4 levels, and then you pick 2 characters. If you're doing the one-player mode, the second character is controlled by the CPU, which is absolutely worthless, so the second character will usually get killed very quickly. Of the 6 characters, 3, Cyclops, Storm, and Iceman, have ranged attacks, which is good, while Wolverine, Nightcrawler, and Colossus have melee attacks, which is very, very bad. At least some characters have a special ability. Nightcrawler can walk through walls, which makes me wonder if he was originally intended to be Kitty Pryde. Most of you probably know this game is universally considered to be quite terrible. Now, it's difficult to really produce much analysis of the Uncanny X-Men simply because there's really not much game here. You see this stuff here? That's basically it. You've seen the entire game. Each of the 4 levels are very similar, a series of vertically scrolling screens in which you are attacked by enemies on a constant basis. The backgrounds change for each level, the enemy sprites change, but the game itself does not. The manual tells you what each level is supposed to be. This is a ruined city, which Magneto is fortifying to make his base of operations on Earth, apparently. But the manual never bothers to tell us anything about the enemies, and in-game they are not identifiable as anything related to the comic. Instead, they're simply a random assortment of generic video game monsters. There are various objects that appear on a regular basis throughout each level. The magnets will cause you to freeze for a moment. The lightning bolt clears the screen of all enemies. Those little things look kind of like an E, refill some of your health. A similar looking S-shaped item freezes enemies temporarily. And best of all is a temporary invincibility item, which is great because, when you have it, you can just run towards the end of the level as quickly as possible and cut down the amount of time spent playing this game. There are also keys needed to unlock doors. At the end of each level is a boss. This is Boomerang, I believe. Now this is rather odd. I died once fighting this boss, but when I came back here to try again, he was gone. He just never reappeared. I could just walk up and grab the item he dropped and move on to the next level. Now here's the odd thing. This is the screen you get when you beat the first level. The text is all white, but it's supposed to have certain letters appear in red text. You have to kill a certain number of enemies for the red text to appear. After you beat all 4 levels, there doesn't appear to be any sort of ending, but in a very, very odd game mechanic, the last level is accessed by beating all 4 levels and then entering a secret code on the stage select screen. You obtain part of the code by putting together the red letters on the outro screen of each level, and the rest of the code is printed on the cartridge label. Putting in the code takes you to the hidden 5th level, where you fight Magneto. It's not really clear who is responsible for this game. LJN seems to have contracted Japanese companies to produce their games, most notably Atlas, who then seemingly subcontracted at least some of them to other companies. Game Developer Research Institute has found evidence that Pixel was involved in this, and some very smart folks have noticed that the Bothet game Topplezip, which I unfortunately covered in episode 23, shares sound effects with X-Men. This has led some folks to conclude that Bothet was behind X-Men, but more likely it means that Pixel developed both games. Either way, X-Men is a classic example of quickie low-end Japanese game design. It even uses the same sprite for all 6 X-Men, only the colors are changed. So Storm and Colossus appear to have about the same amount of body mass, for example. Enemies just appear out of nowhere and move around randomly. There's really nothing that qualifies as a game design here. It's just kind of random stuff thrown together with no rhyme or reason, and it managed to be both too difficult and boring at the same time. So anyway, sorry if this caused anyone to relieve some childhood trauma. Let's move on to some hypothetically less terrible games. Okay, moving along. Here is technically a good game. I can't get too excited about it, but it's better than Cybernoid. Published by Activision, it's Archon, The Light and the Dark. Kind of a sick little animated title screen here. Now, the game of chess has been around for millennia. However, mankind is always finding ways to improve chess by adding in lots of extra stuff. And the good folks at Freefall Associates said, hey, wouldn't chess be way cooler if we made it a bit more like Dungeons and Dragons? So rather than your boring bishops and rooks, we have various fantasy beings and monsters. Now here's the worst part, cover your ears. Holy crap, that's annoying. Now, listen, Archon I guess is a fine game. I have nothing against it. However, it's not really the game for me. I have no plans to study Archon, so if you're looking for some detailed breakdown of the game's many subtleties, then check elsewhere. I will give you sort of like a basic rundown on how it works though. First of all, this is a port of a pretty old game, at least old by 80s gaming standards. Archon was an enormously popular computer game released in 1983 by, are you ready for this? Electronic Arts, those bastards. It was developed by Freefall Associates, a game company founded by John Freeman and Ann Westfall. Get it? Freeman, Westfall, Freefall? It came out on every conceivable computer platform and was a massive hit. One of those archetypal 80s computer games, like Zork or something. 6 years later, it found its way to the NES with greatly revised graphics, ported by Bulletproof Software, famous for their involvement in the Tetris licensing saga. Also, it seems some sound work was done by Goblin Sound. So as you can see, Archon is played on a chessboard, and the concept is very similar to chess. Your pawns are out front, or rather your knights and goblins are out front in this case. Stronger pieces are in the back row. You win either by wiping out the opposing side, or more simply by capturing the 5 power points. Those are those 5 pulsing squares you see there. While in chess, both sides have the same pieces, in Archon there are differences between the light and the dark sides. Light has knights, wizards, golems, valkyries, and so on, while dark has goblins, sorceresses, trolls, banshees, you get the idea. While there are analogous pieces on both sides, wizards and sorcerers are very similar for example, light and dark do play a bit differently, and each side has its strengths and its weaknesses. Now, the huge way this differs from chess is you can't just take a piece by occupying its space. Nope, you must defeat it on the field of battle. In my opinion, this is probably the weakest part of the game. You run around shooting fireballs or whatever at your opponent until one of you dies. It feels kind of janky, and while there is an element of skill involved, the weak piece will usually get beaten by a stronger piece. Certain pieces such as knights and goblins can only use melee attacks, and others such as the phoenix can become temporarily invincible while it damages an opponent. So there are certainly situations where one piece will be totally outmatched. And there's other elements as well. Wizards and sorcerers have magic abilities and can do things like teleport, summon elementals, revive fallen pieces, or imprison enemy pieces, basically freezing them for a couple turns. And as an additional element, the spaces on the board change color over time, which weakens or strengthens the pieces and their abilities. Overall, it's a pretty tricky game to pick up first, lots of little subtleties to learn. It doesn't really feel like a console game. In fact, I think this is the only console port, so we won't ever be seeing this in Chrontendo or Chronturbo. Alright, last US only game this episode, and it's a weird one. It's not even one game, it's two separate games released on one cart. Short Order and Egg-splode. I like this great animated title screen here. So, Power Pad fans, I regret to inform you that this is the last official Power Pad game to be released for the Famicom or NES. 3 years after Bandai published Athletic World in Japan, the Power Pad peripheral is officially dead. It had actually been dead in Japan for a while. A few games were released in 1987, and after that just 2 more from Bandai, both of which were TV show spin-off games, with R.I.P, a hopping vampire game, being the very last one released in January of 1989. In the US, only 5 Power Pad titles had hit the shelves, so I assume Nintendo wanted to put something out for Christmas for people who, had a pad. I mean, Nintendo of America had heavily pushed the Power Pad, basically dropping Rob and hyping the Power Pad instead. They released a Power Set bundle that included the console, the Zapper, and the Power Pad in 1988, and it seemed like everyone had one at the time, but still there were only a few games you could actually use it with. So for this reason, Short Order is one of the very few Nintendo-published NES games that were developed exclusively for the US market. And since Nintendo of America didn't really have a game development division, all of these US-only titles were outsourced to guys like Rare, or in this case, Toze. Yep, Short Order Egg-splode is the first time Toze produced a game for Nintendo themselves, at least that we know of. Now, of all the many Nintendo-published titles for the NES, this is gotta be one of the most minor ones. It's 2 cute, very basic Power Pad games. Short Order is essentially Simon. You just hop around to select the correct ingredients to make a hamburger. Each time you complete a round, another ingredient is added onto the burger. So it's really just a basic memory game. Egg-splode is more of a reflexes game. Foxes place bombs below the hens in the henhouse. You need to squish the bomb before it explodes. Jumping on the correct space allows you to somehow destroy the bomb by crushing it. That's not normally how you defuse a bomb. Also, you need to avoid squishing the eggs that chickens lay. After a bit, the egg will hatch and the chick will fly out, which is not really how it's normally done in a henhouse either. So if you beat a level, this incredibly unenthusiastic dog comes out, holding up the sign that says, "Good." This dog just puts so little effort into congratulating you. He's like almost passive-aggressive about it. Egg-splode gets faster and faster as you beat levels, requiring you to jump around pretty quickly. And I'm 99% sure this was sort of a bone thrown to parents because, after playing a few rounds of this, the kids would just become completely exhausted and be ready for a nap. The game is not rare or valuable, but it seems like it's barely remembered today. Among Nintendo published games, it's relatively obscure. It only has 2 reviews on GameFAQs, and I don't recall any of the various angry type video game dudes discussing this. Nintendo themselves doesn't really seem to have promoted it. I mean, despite being, again, actually published by Nintendo, it only got a single page in Nintendo Power, and then it was never mentioned again. Yet it's not really terrible. I mean, it has nice graphics and sound, and I'm not going to call it a lost gem or anything like that, but it's not awful crap either. So anyway folks, I apologize, but this episode is structured kind of strangely. All the good games are in the last third of the episode, and as for this middle section, we have 3 baseball games in a row, and a football game. Yeah, all 4 came out on December 19th by some weird coincidence. First up is I Love Softball from Coconuts Japan, and apparently developed by Marionette. Coconuts Japan is mostly known for their pachinko games, though we've also seen a pinball game from them. And they're also known for releasing one of the very last Famicom games in Japan, a pachinko-based game that came out in May 1994. So anyway, of these 3 baseball games, 2 are pretty boring, and the third is just weird. I Love Softball is sort of boring. It's a girls' softball game. As you may have noticed, the box art focuses on one of the players' asses. Has a lot of the same issues that most Famicom baseball games have, as well as some unique ones. Right off the bat, we have the normal issue of the one-player mode being ridiculously unfair, as the CPU will effortlessly catch 90% of your hits. Whereas when they're at the bat, the CPU will routinely hit them right into the stands. Or rather, they'll just hit the back wall and bounce off. I didn't see any actual home runs while playing this. Other issues, you can't see where your outfielders are until the camera follows the ball all the way to the back of the playing field, which obviously makes catching balls pretty difficult. This is technically softball, so your pitches are underhand, and I'm not sure I understand them. I threw a lot of pitches that went right over the plate, but were declared balls. Also, sometimes the CPU's batters just wouldn't swing the bat much, and it's pretty unusual to strike out the CPU on these Famicom baseball games. Marionette was not considered a high-end developer, so this might just be kind of wonky programming. For the most part though, aside from the girls' softball angle, this is an unremarkable and pretty much totally forgotten Famicom baseball game. Okay, here's baseball game number 2, a real oddity. Emoyan no Tenbai Pro Yakyuu from Hector. As you may have figured out based on the depiction of the guy on the title screen, this is a game based on a real-life baseball player. Now we have the typical fake team names here. The tires are supposed to be the Hanshin Tigers. The smiles are the Yakult Swallows, and yes, this is Yakult as in the guys who make the yogurt. Like most Famicom baseball games at this time, you can customize things quite a bit by changing the players' names, deciding on the batting order, and so on. All of this looks pretty uneventful so far, but once you start the game, that's when things get a little bit odd. Now I'd like to give this credit for completely throwing out the rulebook when it comes to 8-bit baseball game design. You bat and pitch from the first-person viewpoint, and there is this rather odd interface for positioning your bat. That rectangle on the right lays out where you can swing. You then use the D-pad to move the smaller rectangle to swing high, middle, or low, or to the left or right. The pitcher then throws the ball, and you may or may not get a hit. When you do, the camera switches to this rather unusual 3/4 perspective. Now, pitching is just the opposite. You select where you want to pitch, again using the little rectangle on the right. As I mentioned earlier, this game uses the likeness and name of real-life baseball player Takanori Emoto, the Emoyan of the title. He played for the Hanshin Tigers, and after retiring in 1981, wrote a very popular book about baseball called How to Make Professional Baseball 10 Times as Fun. He followed this up with countless baseball books aimed at a general audience, sometimes 2 or 3 a year. There were even a couple of Emoyan Tenbai movies released on videotape, and of course in 1989 this game was released. He continued writing baseball books up until about sometime this decade, and is a pretty well-known Japanese media figure, landing such gigs as being a judge on Iron Chef. This is a very odd game, and plays a lot differently than most of the other baseball games we've covered. The batting mechanics in particular will cause you no end of grief until you gradually become accustomed to them. This seems to be almost more based on strategy rather than pure skill, and there's even a certain amount of automation here. For example, when the other team gets a hit, your players will run towards the ball automatically. You don't control them directly. I don't really know if this was popular in Japan. There was a Game Boy version of this plan at some point, but its release was eventually cancelled. Anyway, this isn't exactly a recommended game. At least it's a bit more interesting than most of the baseball games we've seen here, just because it's so damn weird. Now, I Love Softball looks virtually avant-garde when compared to Namco's Famista 90, the 5th game in the Family Stadium series. You'll recall that the first Family Stadium game was released in the West as RBI Baseball. However, in 1990, Tengen revived the RBI Baseball name for a series of games that continues on today. Though starting with RBI Baseball 2, it was its own separate series, distinct from the main Family Stadium games. In the past, I've complained about how each new Family Stadium game is exactly the same as the one before it. Nothing ever changes, other than they update the team's rosters. And at this point, I don't know. I mean, what can I possibly say about this game? Each new entry in the series shows some incremental improvement, very minor touches. Tiny little bits of graphical updates have been made. Look at the field here. They've added a few things around the baseline. But the good thing is I'm now past the halfway point in the Famista series. 5 down, only 4 more to go. And I won't have to deal with the Famista series again until I reach December 1990, so about 5 years in real time. After this episode, I don't even think we'll have another baseball game until around March of 1990. So, in addition to the 3 baseball games released on December 19th, we also have a much rarer bird, the Japanese football game. This is published by the record label Pony Canyon and developed by Natsume, of all people. And the flicker effect is pretty cool here. This is Japan, so naturally a girl in a bunny suit was thrown in. The music is sort of decent as well. Graphically, it looks quite nice compared to, say, Famista 90. The teams here are kind of weird. Denver Miles and San Francisco 50s. I mean, those sound stupid, but sort of make sense. But the LA Arcs? The logo looks like the Raiders logo. Remember in '89 the Raiders were in LA, not Oakland? The DC Hogs logo looks like the Redskins logo, but Hogs? And I have no clue with the Chicago Forces, yet there is currently a Chicago WFA team called the Chicago Force. They weren't around in the 80s, so either there's some kind of obvious meaning to the name that I'm not understanding, or it's just a really weird coincidence. You know, from a purely aesthetic standpoint, I like Quarterback Scramble. The colors, the animation, all looks very clean and appealing. The game itself is certainly not going to make anyone forget Tecmo Bowl. It's pretty rudimentary, just pick a formation, then if you're playing defense, tackle the guy, or an offense, try to make a pass. The one guide I found online suggested always going with the 6-2-3 formation when playing defense against the computer, and when playing offense, just try to make a bunch of short passes. Quarterback Scramble is pretty obscure. You won't find any detailed playthroughs on YouTube, and there are 0 reviews on GameFAQs. However, it was scheduled for a US release at one point, under the name Mike Ditka's Big Play Football. Chris Biniak of Video Games and Computer Entertainment posted a copy of the press release from Accolade on his website, which gives a late 1990 release date. And a prototype actually turned up a few years later. NESguide.com uploaded some footage which shows that very little was changed from the original, other than a new title screen and some English text. Even the team names are still the same, so it appears they didn't actually have the license to use the name Chicago Bears, just Mike Ditka's name. I don't know why this was cancelled, but Ditka eventually did get his own football video game, Mike Ditka's Power Football, an unlicensed Genesis game from 1991. So there's nothing really wrong with Quarterback Scramble. It's just a very simple football game that probably wouldn't have made much of an impact on the US market. It's not terrible, and more importantly, at least it's not another baseball or golf game. Alright, so we just have only one game released each on December 20th and 21st. The Money Game 2 was published by Silphil, a not very interesting developer that mostly specialized in simulation games, including of course the first Money Game, released in August 1988. This was a visually unpleasant looking text-heavy game about trying to make money on the stock market, as well as get married, have a kid, and buy a series of increasingly expensive cars. Money Game 2 follows this pattern relatively closely. You appear to be a somewhat brow-beaten salaryman who is trying to obtain the good life for himself. It's certainly slicker looking than the first Money Game, but the basic interface is the same. From your office you use your computer, telephone, etc. to buy and sell stocks, also to speak to bankers, advisors, and so on, as well as interacting with your girlfriend. The newspaper will give you tips as to what stocks are doing well. Now previously, Silphil had localized a casino game called $1 Million Kid and released it in the US as Casino Kid. Following this pattern, the Money Game 2 was rebranded as Wall Street Kid and made its way to America in June 1990. Now, the basic structure of the two games is the same. However, the graphics and plot have been completely reworked from the ground up. The main character is a preppyish looking douchebag who is about to inherit the Benedict family fortune. But there is a Brewster's Millions style clause in the will. You need to make enough money to buy a house, get married, and finally purchase the Benedict family castle in Europe. Only once you have proven yourself worthy will you be able to inherit the absurdly huge sum of $600 billion. You get $500,000 to get you started. Now, if you were to sit down and play Wall Street Kid, and I can't say I'd recommend it, you would find it extremely repetitive, almost ritualistic. Every day begins with reading the paper, which mentions the interest rates, the current stock trends, and a bit of mostly unhelpful news, such as a new video game being released or a rock concert selling out. Everything is done in this screen. You can call a few people on the phone, for example, to try to get a loan or ask for stock tips, but mostly you use the computer, the flower base, and what the manual calls the barometer for some reason. The computer is used for buying and selling stocks. It's just a list of stocks with names similar to real-life companies. The paper tells you what stocks are currently hot, so it's helpful to buy those. The flower base contacts your girlfriend, and you can take her out to a picnic, shopping, or to the carnival. The barometer allows you to exercise, either at the gym, the swimming pool, or the hiking trail. And finally, the clock ends the day. The thing is, there's really not that much to do during the day. The stock trends cycle on a weekly basis, so you might only need to buy or sell once a week. Often a day will just consist of taking your girlfriend out and exercising. Now there are a couple ways you can lose. First of all, not exercising kills you surprisingly quickly. Your girlfriend gives you a few hints before this happens, letting you know how terrible you look. Likewise, your girl will dump you if you don't keep her happy. This seems to take a long time, and you can make her mad by taking her on the wrong date based on the news. For example, if the paper says that there were crimes happening at the shopping mall, and then you offer to take her to the mall, she'll get mad. You also have to buy her things to keep her happy, but again, there are no immediate consequences. Apparently it takes a pretty long time of doing this over and over again before it bites you in the ass. Mostly though, you can lose by just not having enough money. There are deadlines for buying the house, the boat, etc. And if you haven't saved up enough money by the end of the month, for the house for example, another buyer will snatch it up and you'll lose. Because apparently there's only one rich guy house for sale in whatever city this is, so you can't just go out and buy some other house. Likewise, if you agree to purchase the house but you haven't saved up enough money at that point, the deal will fall through and you'll also lose the game. Same goes for buying the yacht, the castle, and so on. I certainly can't recommend this to anybody. The linearity and repetitiveness makes it pretty damn boring. I mean, there weren't very many simulation games on consoles at this time, so I think it may have seemed kind of fresh back in 1989, but today you probably shouldn't bother. December 31st, and we have just one game today. From Jaleco, it's Lord of King. We had previously seen Lord of Sword, and here there's another awkwardly titled game that ended up getting its name changed when it came out in the US. Jaleco must have had this one pegged for the Western market, since a mere 3 months later, in March, this was released as Astyanax. Yeah, so the kid's name is Astyanax, from Greek mythology, he thinks. It's called a wet dream, kid. You need to get laid. Now, as far as I can tell, nothing was changed for this US version, other than translating the text. Is she wearing leg warmers? This is just so 1980s. Anyway, this fairy creature named Cutie says the princess has been kidnapped by some evil dude named Blackthorn, and you need to rescue her. It feels like we've seen this plot used before somewhere. So armed with a mighty axe, you head out to kick some monster ass. Now, Astyanax is a very, very basic side-scrolling action game. It's literally just walk forward and kill things. You also do a bit of jumping. Now the first thing you might notice is the hit detection is pretty odd. For example, this is a hit. It looks like you need to jump up a step in order to hit the skeletons, but no, it somehow just barely makes contact. However, this is not a hit. But this is. Just look at this. It's ridiculous. So be prepared for some very unintuitive action in this game. I originally thought there was no possible way I could hit those things from this position, so I tried jumping and attacking them, which would always lead to my death. It's so odd that you are clearly not touching these things, yet they die. You find various power-ups in these little golden post things. This one's a weapons upgrade. It increases the length of your power bar and the damage that your magic does. Here's the first mini-boss. Dude looks like he has 2 horse sticks for a head. As you may have gathered, the LF bar is your life force. The SP is your spell points, I assume. It looks like you have a lot, but casting a spell uses up multiple points. After you defeat this dude, you then get to the real first boss immediately afterwards. Your life and magic refill after each level, thank goodness, otherwise this game would be very difficult. They have these nice, relatively long cutscenes between levels. So here's the thing, in the US version, Blackthorn's skeleton flunky is named Thorndog. That's right, Thorndog. Heart of stone, face of bone, as the manual calls him. That aside, Astyanax suffers from being a pretty uninspired game. There's really not much variation here, you just see the same enemies over and over. Level design is pretty much walking left to right along a flat surface, with a few jumps here and there. There are a few exceptions, such as the very annoying last level, but at least the bosses are mostly cool looking. I wonder why they call this Astyanax though. It's such a weird random name to attach to this. The character states the name is from Greek mythology, which is sort of correct. Astyanax was a minor figure in the Trojan War, the young son of Hector, king of Troy. He appears in various Greek and Roman Trojan War narratives, and is generally thought to have been killed during the fall of Troy, most famously by being thrown off the city walls. Anywho, the semi-final level is one of those levels like that castle from Super Mario Bros., where you have to take a specific path through the level, otherwise you'll just keep moving around in a loop. There are various doors in each section, and you need to keep entering the correct one or get sent back to the beginning. It's very annoying. At the end, you face off with Thorndog himself. After defeating him, he tells you that he's created some kind of magic seal that will kill you if you try to leave the castle, so you're stuck there forever. Then, Cutie bravely sacrifices herself to break the seal, and we get this dramatic, powerful scene. The final level, the tower, is just a boss rush, followed by Blackthorn himself. He's a two-part boss. First, you fight him in his sort of normal quasi-human form. He's pretty simple, just whack him with a sword a bit. and then you must face off against his true form, a huge multi-sprite dragon with a jewel in his chest. You damage him by hitting the jewel, obviously. All of this sounds very Castlevania-like, and while Astyanax does resemble the Castlevania games, compared to Castlevania III, which came out literally one day later, Astyanax is a barren wasteland of a game. It lacks any sense of adventure, exploration, or surprise. The most notable thing about it is the relatively heavy cutscenes between levels. The ending is pretty weird. Astyanax returns to Earth and back to his normal life when he encounters Cutie, who is now no longer a fairy but a normal-sized human, and yet they don't recognize each other at first and walk right past each other, which is strange. And then the princess appears and says, "Hey, Cutie returning to life is a reward for your bravery," which is also a little odd. In conclusion, Astyanax is not nearly as good as I was hoping it would be. It's merely a game with good production values, but little inspiration. Here we have another massively successful sequel, Double Dragon 2: The Revenge, from good old Technos Japan. Another game that demonstrates how publishers' strategies were changing in the late 80s, early 90s. First of all, this was released in the US almost immediately. Nintendo's official games list states January 1990, apparently around the same time as River City Ransom's US release. River City was, I believe, the first Technos game to be published by Technos themselves in the US. Previously, a few Technos titles, such as the first Double Dragon, were put out by Trade West in the United States. With Double Dragon 2, however, Technos went with Acclaim, who also handled the North American release for Double Dragon 3. Regardless, this once again shows the rising importance of the English-speaking market for Japanese game companies. So we have the heroes from the first game, brothers Billy and Jimmy, despite the fact that in the first Double Dragon, Jimmy turned out to be the leader of the Shadow Warriors and was killed by Billy at the end of the game. Double Dragon 2 engages in a bit of retcon, since in the two-player version, Billy and Jimmy are both still alive and out to get revenge for the slaying of Billy's girlfriend. And unlike the NES version of the first game, this has a true two-player version, where Jimmy and Billy are on the screen together, just like in the arcade game. Now, for this video I'll be using the Japanese game, since the US version was made a bit tougher by giving you 3 difficulty levels, just like the Japanese version, except the lower 2 difficulty modes aren't the entire game. You have to choose the Supreme Master difficulty level to get all the way to the end. Also, the Japanese version has infinite continues, and the US version does not, and honestly, I've never played this game until now. It's pretty hard, and there's no way I'd get very far with the US version. Double Dragon 2 originally hit arcades in 1988, and it feels very similar to the original title, with no major changes to the gameplay, just slightly improved graphics. One thing about the Famicom Double Dragon 2, it's an example of the growing trend of what I'll call ninja guidification of NES games, where arcade ports are significantly altered to make them more console-y. In this case, a number of the levels have been changed, and some platforming elements have been added, much to the game's detriment, in my opinion. The Genesis port, as we'll eventually see, sticks pretty closely to the original arcade game. Now, there are a few things in Double Dragon 2 that you might have trouble getting used to if you've played the first one on the NES. The controls have been reworked to resemble the arcade versions, so rather than one button being used to kick and the other to punch, both buttons are now used for punches and kicks. The A button will punch to the right if you are facing right. The B button will punch to the left if you are facing left. So if there are enemies on both sides of you and you are facing the enemy on your right, you would press A, and then to punch the enemy behind you, turn around and press B. However, to kick, you press the other button, the one that doesn't throw a punch, meaning that if you face right and hit the B button, you will kick, and the kicks are always back kicks. You never kick a guy in front of you. In other words, the control scheme flips itself every time you change directions. It's very unusual and definitely takes some getting used to, so playing this for the first time will kind of send your head spinning. You also have a few additional moves that are automatically triggered when you hit an enemy and then get in close, like the knee to the face or the over-the-shoulder throw. Another major bummer in Double Dragon 2 is the jump. Since both of the NES buttons are used in attacking, jumping is done by pressing A and B together, which is a bit awkward. I mean, this would be okay if jumping were used minimally, but for some reason Technos decided to add in several short, unnecessary platforming sections. A couple of these involved conveyor belt style platforms, and this would be fine in Mega Man or something, but here it just feels like a way to produce frustration in the player, and maybe even squeeze in a few cheap deaths. Jumping is also used in performing the most powerful attacks, such as the Hurricane Kick, the Uppercut, and the Knee Attack, that inexplicably throws enemies all the way across the screen. These are extremely useful, but a bit tricky to pull off. Double Dragon 2 sold a ton of carts in the US, so it must have done something right. However, the odd control scheme is definitely a bit off-putting to newbies like me. This would be so much better if only the NES had another button. As it stands, I liked it quite a bit less than I did River City Ransom. Here we are, folks, the big one, Castlevania III, the Marathon, not your average 50-yard dash of Famicom. For you people nowadays who are into old games, I suspect a lot of you would put Castlevania III up there with the absolute top tier of NES games, up there with Mega Man 2 and Super Mario 3 and so on. For example, IGN a couple years ago did a list of best NES games and put it at number 5. And while it is a beautifully made game, it can also be brutally hard at times. And the series eventually backed away from this approach with the very popular Symphony of the Night and the so-called Igavania games. Anyway, as you know, Castlevania III is titled Akumaju Densetsu, or Demon Castle Legend in Japan. The word Densetsu, when used in game titles, tends to connote a more adventure game feel rather than straight-up action, as in Zelda no Densetsu, and is often used in RPGs or other games that tend towards the non-linear side. In this case, Castlevania III offers more player choice. There are branching paths and multiple playable characters. Now, the US version was released in September 1990, a pretty long wait compared to Double Dragon 2, but there were some changes and additions made in the US version. The most obvious thing we'll notice is that the music is different. Konami used a custom chip, the VRC6, or Virtual ROM Controller 6. This allowed for an additional 3 sound channels. Since it was incompatible with the American NES, Konami had to rejigger the music to use Nintendo's MMC5 chip instead, losing some sound channels in the process. Here's a comparison. Now, today we'll be playing a translation of the Japanese version, so we can listen to the dope-ass soundtrack while still being able to read the dialogue and appreciate the deep characterization. The plot here gives some background on Dracula. After causing a bunch of hullabaloo in Transylvania, the church asks the Belmont family to take him out. The hero here is Trevor Belmont, or Ralph in the Japanese version. Trevor is the forefather of Simon Belmont, and is the origin of the Belmont warlord chromosomes, according to the manual. In Castlevania lore, this takes place in 1476, right around the time that the real-life Vlad Tepes died, and Castlevania 1 takes place in 1691, though according to the game itself, Castlevania 3 happens 100 years before the first one. Dracula is also identified as Vlad Tepes in this game, though later he got retconned into a non-famous dude named Matthias Kronkvist. Castlevania 3 combines the mechanics of the first Castlevania with something resembling the world of Simon's Quest. You begin in a destroyed village and travel through forests, swamps, and so on, before reaching Dracula's castle near the end of the game. You also reach a fork in the road and are confronted with a choice of which direction to go. The upper path will take you through a familiar clock tower-like setting, complete with giant swinging gears, spikes, and Medusa heads. I'm not really sure why spikes are necessary in a clock tower. At the top you'll find Grant Dynasty, your first spirit companion. Once you defeat him, he'll offer to join you in your quest to destroy Dracula. You can switch back and forth between Trevor and your spirit companion at will, and each spirit has different strengths and weaknesses. Grant can throw daggers, at least in the Japanese version, and climb on walls, thus allowing you to take shortcuts and sometimes bypass certain tricky sections. Now, if you took the lower path earlier, you will skip the clock tower and Grant, and your path will then converge with the upper path. A little bit further down the road and you'll come to the game's main fork. These two paths lead you on two entirely different sets of levels, though one boss fight does appear in both paths. They don't meet up until the final level, Dracula's Lair, so Konami has basically given us two games in one. Super Mario 3 offered a similar sort of non-linearity, though in Castlevania 3 you would technically have to play the game 3 times to see all the content, and there are 6 total possible routes to take in the game, and there are 4 different endings. The upper path, which we are seeing here, is considered the easy path, so to speak. We'll quickly encounter a Cyclops boss, who defeating will release Sifa, who just happens to be a vampire hunter. She's sort of the weak physical / strong magic character, and her magic attacks can be quite useful. You can only have one spirit buddy at a time, so you'll need to say goodbye to Grant if you want Sifa to join your party. Now, while Sifa is female, whoever was responsible for the US manual must not have gotten the memo, because Sifa is referred to as he, though the illustration used is pretty ambiguous. And it's possible this was intended to be a Metroid-style switcheroo, since at the end of the game she takes off her hood and then her long hair falls down. So you make your way through Dracula's castle, fighting the standard Castlevania enemies, and encountering Frankenstein, previously seen in the first Castlevania, and a water dragon, and finally a 3-part boss fight with mummies, the Cyclops again, and a giant demon. Luckily, the Cyclops and demon behave in very predictable patterns, so you can easily defeat them if you're careful and don't take any silly risks. Finally, your path will take you to Castlevania 1's main hall, and the original music theme starts playing. Okay, great, but what if you took the lower path back at the main fork? Then you find yourself along the harder underground path to Dracula's tower. Now, in my opinion, the underground levels are actually a bit of a bitch, though they do introduce a lot of new stuff to the series, like these little traps that ensnare you between enemies, acid that drips down from the ceiling and dissolves the ground. This is employed in several puzzle-like rooms, lots of blocks that crumble when you step on them, and so on. Now, instead of Sypha, you'll encounter Alucard on the lower path. Defeating him, and he'll introduce himself as Dracula's son, and says that he hates his dad and wants to kill him. Obviously, later Alucard became a pretty well-loved character in the Castlevania series. The name Alucard, of course, comes from Universal's 1943 movie, Son of Dracula. Though in this movie, the mysterious Count Alucard, played by Lon Chaney Jr., turns out to be Dracula himself at the end.
Coming by car. Don't worry, he'll show up.
D-R-A-C...
What are you mumbling about?
Nothing, just a silly idea hit me. Well, if there's no Alucard, there's no need of our waiting around here. I've got to get back to the office.
Incidentally, Chaney could not repeat the role for the next movie Dracula appeared in, House of Frankenstein, because that movie also featured the werewolf and Chaney had to play that role instead. Now, of course, everybody likes Alucard, but he's a little bit lame as a playable character in this game. He shoots fireballs, which have good range, but are very weak. He doesn't have any special attacks except that he can use the stopwatch, and he can turn into a bat and fly, which might help you out in certain areas with tricky jumps, but changing to a bat uses up hearts at the rate of about 1 per second, and getting hit will cause you to transform back into human form. So this is something that you really can't exploit too much. As I said earlier, just like Super Mario 3 or Mega Man 2 and 3, Castlevania 3 is almost like the perfect example of a sequel on the Famicom. It's longer, about twice the length of the first one. It doesn't dramatically change the gameplay style or mechanics, but instead adds in new elements. For example, the spirit companions and their new abilities. It offers up new monsters and environments, yet still has various callbacks to the first game, such as the clock tower, the stairs leading up to Dracula, and so on. It's an excellent balance of familiar and new elements. The graphics are more detailed, that special sound chip was used to improve the music. Castlevania 3 just feels like a lot of time and money went into it. There are more bosses here than in the first game. Frankenstein, mummies, death all return, as well as a lot of new stuff. And in the underground path there's a rather creative boss fight, the Bone Dragon. After you have done some damage to him, he escapes, causing the chamber to begin flooding. A bit later, after you escape the floodwaters, he will suddenly reappear and you'll need to finish him off. One thing about this game, as we know, it can be horrendously hard at times. Konami did not make Trevor Belmont any faster or more agile. You can still only whip straight ahead, you can still fall off stairs to your death, you can't run, and you still jump in the same slow, unchangeable arc. Once you hit the jump button, you are committed. Can't speed up or slow down or turn around. And getting hit while in the middle of a jump, say from one ledge to another, will frequently cause you to fall to your death. The underground path in particular is just stuffed with brutally hard moments. This game loves to throw you in a situation where you have enemies attacking you from the front and from behind at the same time. Levels where the blocks crumble as you stand on them will constantly push you forward. There's really no time to plan or strategize, you just have to keep jumping. Timed levels also punish you severely for making mistakes. Missing a jump and landing on a lower platform can mean unavoidable death. The falling block room is one of the toughest simply because it's so long. Blocks fall from above, allowing you to slowly reach the top of the screen. It's quite easy to accidentally take a few blocks to the head and die. The lower path, just like the upper one, will eventually take you to Dracula's tower, skipping the rest of the castle completely. Essentially, you have traveled below the castle instead of going through it. So both paths merge again at Dracula's tower, which sort of resembles Castlevania 1 in miniature. There are 3 bosses in this level, starting off with our old buddy the Grim Reaper, probably the hardest boss in the game. He sends out these damn sickles everywhere. Sippa's lightning magic is pretty powerful against him, but her ice magic is useless. So if you got stuck with the ice or holy water, this is going to be an extremely tough fight. His second form is this giant fanged skull, who thankfully only throws one sickle at you at a time. Also, a little bit later, you must battle yourself. Luckily, you're not too tough, though if you change to a spirit companion form, so will the boss, but there is a little bit of delay that you can take advantage of. After some tricky jumping in the clock tower, you climb up those familiar stairs to meet the man himself. One interesting thing is that none of the bosses, even Dracula himself, utter a single word in this game. Quite a bit of a difference from the windbag Dracula in Symphony of the Night. This guy doesn't want to debate you, he just wants to kill you, no questions asked. Okay, so final boss Dracula has 3 forms. Classic Drac, weird gooey slime monster Drac, and giant demon. His third form appears to be based on Pazuzu, the Mesopotamian wind demon, and it's possibly inspired by the depiction of Pazuzu in the Dungeons & Dragons monster manual, which I assume is also how Pazuzu ended up in Dragon Quest and the Final Fantasy games. As I mentioned earlier, Konami ramped up the difficulty quite a bit for the US version, so Dracula is a lot easier in the Japanese game. He shoots fewer projectiles at you during his final form, and if you die you restart right outside the stairs leading up to his chamber. Instead, the game actually sends you back a couple rooms. There are 4 different endings, one for each of the different companions that you can finish the game with, and a 4th if you finish the game without having a companion. Since you don't actually have to accept any of the companions, you can just turn them down when they ask to join you. As far as we can tell, the main creative force behind the NES Castlevania games was one Hitoshi Akamatsu. Sources state that game design decisions were typically made in team meetings, but Akamatsu was apparently the lead programmer and more or less in charge of the project. He was responsible for a lot of the creative decisions in these games, and is often thought of as the creator of Castlevania. As good as Castlevania III was, it apparently sold pretty poorly in Japan. Famitsu gave it a 30 out of 40, the same score they gave Famista 90, if you can believe that. Akamatsu was apparently demoted due to the game's low sales, and left Konami, then he pretty much disappeared, I think. No one has been able to track him down. And of course, the post-Akamatsu Castlevanias all play very differently than the first 3. So it's kind of a bittersweet note to end the Castlevania series on the NES, but at least later we will come across Rondo of Blood. Ooh boy, there's a bunch of kind of lame games this episode, and I regret to inform you that we have another one here. TM Network Live and Powerful. Even though that word salad doesn't really mean much to you, it presumably brought a bit of doki doki to the hearts of Japanese teeny boppers. You see, TM Network sounds like some kind of cable TV channel, but it is actually the name of a Japanese pop band from the 1980s. TM is reportedly short for Time Machine, which is very appropriate since this game has sort of a Terminator-style plot about traveling back in time to prevent the end of the world. So the game starts off in the future, 1999, when a satellite malfunctions and blows up the Earth or something. You somehow end up going back in time to December 1989. Yes, exactly when this game came out, December 1989, in order to save the world. This sounds okay so far, but did I mention this is a menu-based adventure game? Yes, another one of those. So, who were TM Network, exactly? Well, they were a trio of hairsprayed young men who churned out a bunch of singles and albums from the mid-80s to early 90s. They look kind of like they might be the Japanese Duran Duran, but their music is maybe even a little bit less adventurous, and runs from drum machine-based dance pop to the blandest middle-of-the-road pop imaginable. One song they are remembered for is 1987's Get Wild, which was used in the City Hunter anime. Maybe you're familiar with the bizarre live adaptation of City Hunter, the one with Jackie Chan from the 1990s, where he gets zapped by a Street Fighter cabinet and turns into various characters from Street Fighter. So anyway, it's a run-of-the-mill Japanese adventure game, one made maybe a bit less interesting than most, simply because so much of the game consists of talking to the members of TM Network. It's interesting that despite being published by Epic Sony and starring a music group, the actual in-game music is pretty forgettable and repetitive. Now you might remember that Sony released another game based on a Japanese music group, Saikima 2, way back in 1986, only 3 years earlier, but that's like a million years in Chrontendo time. Sony would continue to release some Famicom games in the early 90s, often movie tie-ins such as Hudson Hawk and Cliffhanger, and then, I don't know, I guess Sony got out of the video game business or something. Based on the stuff we've been seeing here, video games just isn't Sony's forte. So anyway, after this, there's one last game and then we'll wrap it up. Our 15th and final game today, Mappy Kids, the third and last game in the Mappy saga. Here's another game with no music on the title screen, which is typically a bad sign, though considering how tiresome Mappy Kids' music is, I'm okay with it in this case. There are both a one-player and a two-player mode. The one-player uses a horizontal split screen, but is actually a little bit shorter than the one-player version. So booting up, we see that Mappy Kids looks kind of like Super Mario Bros. 3, which came out around 14 months before this, so this could be completely intentional. However, unlike Super Mario 3 or Castlevania 3 or other games that have a map screen like this, Mappy Kids is completely linear. The map screen doesn't serve any function other than allow you to chart your progress through the game and get a vague hint as to what the next level will look like. As a little refresher on the Mappy series, our little police mouse first appeared in arcades in 1983. We covered the Famicom adaptation, Appropriately enough, it was a vertically structured platformer, much like the original Mario Brothers, with an added twist of moving from level to level using little trampolines. Mappy Land was a console-only sequel in 1986, in which you travel through various environments trying to win the hand of your girlfriend. It's an odd little game. It still uses trampolines in most places, but also uses horizontal level design and feels almost like a Super Mario Bros. Style platformer. It was developed by Toze and got a US release by Taxon. In Mappy Kids, the police theme has been completely disposed of, and you're playing as Mappy's son, Happy. Happy is a bit more bourgeois than his father, and spends the game not fighting crime, but instead accumulating wealth so he can buy a fancy house for his wife. You get money both by collecting those yen symbols and by kicking open the little chests and grabbing jewels and rings and such. The jump and the kick are your only moves. You can also kill enemies by kicking them, and you can smash certain blocks that might be obstructing your path. Again, this will remind you a lot of the Super Mario Bros. Games. Though the game that mostly comes to mind when playing Mappy Kids is Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers, which would come out about 6 months later. Though, unlike Rescue Rangers, Mappy Kids is not really considered a classic. Sadly, this was the last game in the Mappy series, on consoles at least. Years later, Namco put out some cell phone games, but Mappy Kids was definitely the most ambitious game in the Mappy series. So there isn't that much text in this, but some of the minigames do require you to understand what's being said, so we will look at this unofficial translation. We learn that Mappy just picked out a wife for his son. Oh, and by the way, Happy, can you also build a house for her? Thanks. And you think your parents are controlling. Imagine your dad not only doing this, but then letting you know by mailing you a letter. Now earlier I mentioned the mini-games. Between levels you have a slot machine, and then you play one of 3 types of mini-games. The slot machine, again something taken right out of Super Mario Bros. 3, will either give you money, a special prize, or if you get the skull, you will lose a bunch of money. You will then take another turn on the slot machine to pick your opponent in the minigame. Now there's 3 types of minigames. The flag game has you following instructions to lower or raise semaphore flags. Unlike Western semaphore, in Japan the flags are solid red and white. You're given instructions to either hold the flag up or down, but at the same time you are also told whether or not to obey the instructions. So white flag down, don't do this, means put the flag in the raised position. It's quite odd and might take a minute to understand what you're supposed to do, but once you figure it out, it's very simple. The other games we have here, there's sort of a sumo wrestling match where you attempt to push each other out of the ring using your butt. It's mostly a button mashing game. Note the other Namco characters in the audience. And the third minigame is one of those spot the difference type puzzles. You need to look at 2 similar images and pick out something that differs in the second one before the timer runs out. Now depending on how well you did, you will either win or lose money, which you can then spend in the shop to buy parts for your house, windows, fences, that kind of thing. The ultimate goal is to have the house fully built when you complete the last level. The levels are pretty simply designed, though not necessarily easy. Unlike the Mario games, it's not always clear how you interact with things. Sometimes objects look like they can be jumped on, but turn out to be merely background objects. And some platforms can be jumped through from below, while others can't. And it's not always possible to know for sure until you try jumping and see whether or not you hit your head. There's a few items to find in the chests. Roller skates make you go faster, and there's a rare temporary invincibility item, but there's really nothing in terms of secrets to look for. There's no hidden areas, warps, secret power-ups. It's strictly walk forward, avoid the enemies, and open the chests. This was developed by the company now known as Arc System Works. Back in 1989 they were called just Arc, I believe, and worked on a few Famicom and Mega Drive games. Later, of course, it became known for the Guilty Gear series and other fighting games. There's really nothing special about Mappy Kids. It's a nice-looking, simple platformer. You probably won't feel motivated to play all the way through to the end, though. Wow, what a motley collection of games. And what should I pick for the best game this episode? I was originally just going to go with Castlevania III. I mean, everybody loves that game, right? But I also have to be objective, and I'll defer to Famista's infallible judgment and declare it to be a tie between Castlevania III and Famista 90. It's impossible to say which of these games are better. They are both a solid 75 out of 100. As for the worst game honors, I was tempted to say the Uncanny X-Men, but people have been trashing that game for so long. I'm gonna go with Ironsword, which is mostly mocked for its box art rather than the game itself. I mean, X-Men is mostly boring, whereas Ironsword is actively terrible. It's both tedious and incredibly irritating. It almost seems bad on purpose. I really don't understand any of the decisions the developers made when designing this thing. Next time, wow, there's like 4 Japanese games left from 1989, including a classic from Sunsoft, a game a lot of you loved as a kid. We're also going to wrap up a few US games from December, and then the first batch of games from 1990. But before then, we'll have a new Chrontendo episode and a new Video Nasties. So stay tuned.